Hello?
Hello?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, is Helga here?
I don't think so.
Oh, oh. Ah, wait, here she is.
Hello?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good that everything is working.
Oh, yes, this is a good idea.
Yes, I'm excited about this concept.
3 girls of Shanghai?
We are no longer girls, though.
No, I don't know about that. I never gave Kevin my birth year, you know.
I don't know. It's remarkable that I'm so healthy at my age. I'm actually quite shocked at my condition. My mother passed away at age 98 and was teaching yoga at 95 years old. We have spirit, you know.
I don't recall exactly. I try not to recall in my book and all the documentaries. They put always my age. No one else. But that's okay. Okay, the day will come when I will admit it, yeah.
Do you know how this play is going to work? Kevin says he and Kari-Anne are thinking about having it as a Zoom meeting.
Yes, a Zoom meeting, very much with the times.
And you know, Kevin asked me to provide music for the play. I learned how to play the piano in Shanghai. I'm just not sure how the music will be incorporated into the play.
I guess we need to trust Kevin and Kari-Anne will figure that out somehow.
Kevin says they want us to talk about our lives and convey whatever messages we think we see in our lives to young people. You know, I've written many poems about my life and I've always wanted to set them to music. Maybe that's how I can incorporate music into the play.
Yes, and I have been giving this much thought. I want to talk about how China was an important place for Jews to flee the anti Semitism of Tsarist Russia.
Oh, interesting. I want to do the same, but about the Nazis.
And my focus is on the anti Semitism of the British.
Yes, the British were the biggest racists in Shanghai. I heard you were one of the Sephardim, yes?
Yes.
So, how should we proceed? You know, I give talks about the Jews in Shanghai, and one talk I give is about the different waves of migration, starting with the Sephardim, those Jews who had been expelled from Spain in the 15th century and who came to Shanghai via the Middle East or India in the mid-19th century. Then the Russian Jews at the turn of the century through the Russian Revolution and Russian Civil War. And then the European refugees in the late 1930s. Maybe we should go in that order.
Okay, I'll begin then. I'm Esther Schifrin. I was Esther Benjamin as a child in China. I was actually born in Hong Kong by default because my mother went to Hong Kong when the Japanese had a skirmish with the Chinese in 1937, which they called an incident, but it was actually an all-out war against China. And so my mother went to Hong Kong, gave birth to me, and then we went back to Shanghai. We're really Shanghai people. In the early 1840s, my father's family first went to Shanghai. My great-great-grandfather had been a ship's captain, and he was living in India. The family had been living in India for hundreds of years. They probably went to India from Spain after the Inquisition or during the Inquisition, and they traveled back and forth from India to China, probably taking things like silk and cotton, spices, including, of course, opium. My father's family, the Benjamins, were amongst the prominent people who came to Shanghai at the beginning. The Kaduris and the Sassoons and the Hardoons all came to Shanghai at that time as well. And they were like the big names. And the Benjamins were as well. We came together with those beginners who actually built Shanghai. They built the Bund, which, by the way, is not a German word at all. It is not the Bund. It's the waterfront. And many people don't even know that. You can look it up, it's in the dictionary. Shanghai was the Paris of the East. It was known. We used to go to these huge, beautiful emporiums, they called them, big buildings, the equivalent of any one of our big department stores. And then on each floor, they had something. They would have a dance going on because the Chinese loved dancing. So they had tea dances, and it was not unheard of for people to go in the morning to lunch. They'd wear a tuxedo because they were going to lunch, then to a tea dance, and then to a cocktail party at 6 or 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, I don't know. There was a British colonial life. They lived it up.
My family also became a part of that colonial life. But my family got to China later than yours, and we were never close to being as well off as the Sephardim.
Yes, my family was very wealthy. My mother's father was a rabbi, and my father was very observant. We went to synagogue regularly. It was lovely, actually, to go to synagogue because we saw all our friends there and we knew all the services very well and we knew everyone. And we knew there'd be a delicious lunch to follow and so on. But we found the other aspects of it very restrictive. And later on, really, I took my father to task, how shall we say, for the fact that we couldn't play the piano on Saturday because I used to say, King David used to play music. Why aren't we allowed to? I just love music, and I didn't understand why he wouldn't let me sing or write on Saturday. Now I write all the time. Oh, how do you like these lyrics? As a child, I lived in China, though we were not Chinese. For several generations, we lived a life of ease. We mingled very freely with people of all races, from many different countries, with many colored faces. Then war began in Europe and reached our distant shore. Our life was changed immediately. Our comfort was no more.
That's fascinating. Tell us more about your childhood before the war.
Our synagogue was Ohel Rachel. Everyone attended synagogue on Shabbat. My grandparents had a very big house, and they, after service, would invite the congregation to come if anyone wanted to. The house was a 24-roomed house. There were 2 Sikhs at the gate, so nobody could just come in. And there was a tennis court at the back and a swimming pool, and children would play on the lawns. And the servants were walking in and out with white jackets and smartly dressed, carrying silver trays with new cutlery. And there was food, so much food.
Yes, that was a level of wealth so removed from us stateless Russian Jews.
Yes, but we lost all of that during the war. The Japanese took everything. Were you born in Shanghai, Lillian?
Yes, yes, I was born in Shanghai as Lillian Willens, which is still my name today. Oh, that at that time I was born in the French concession. It was a time of extraterritoriality where the British and the Americans and the French controlled the city of Shanghai. My parents met in Shanghai, but they had come from Russia. My father lived in the middle of a town close to Kiev. At that time, it was Russian, old province. My mother lived in Siberia. The Russian Jews in Shanghai, such as our family, had fled the Bolshevik Revolution. They went to Harbin, China, and then because when the Japanese were there were problems in Harbin. So they decided to move to Shanghai. And they were protected. Although they were stateless, they were protected by the three powers: English, French, and Americans. In Shanghai, my father and mother met and married in 1924. The three of us children were born there in the French concession. I have an older sister, and I was born maybe 7 or 8 years later. Then came my younger sister.
Did you attend synagogue?
So we were brought up really, I would say we knew everything about Judaism. I mean, the culture. I'm talking about the culture, the food, the friends, but not much about the religion. And I think that had to do with my father, because I think at that time they did not think highly of women. You know, they were segregated upstairs or all separated in synagogue. So women were there, I think, to cook and bring up children. My father was the religious one. He would see to it that we would have kosher food, but I don't think the Chinese cook knew about it. But my mother, she didn't care as much, so very often we sneaked away with non-kosher food. So the upbringing was in the household. We knew the Jews, we knew our friends, were Jewish there in Shanghai, of course now in Shanghai, but I associated with different religious people, such as my classmates and my mother's friends. But Helga, tell us about yourself. What was your journey to Shanghai like?
Well, my name is now Helga Silberberg, but I was born Helga Maya in Berlin, Germany on November 25th, 1932. My father was born in the part of Germany that became Poland after World War I. He lived in the German part. He lived in Germany his whole life until he immigrated to Shanghai. I don't know a lot about my grandparents. I know who they were, but they had passed away long before I was born because my father married very late in life. He was 50 when he married. I do know about his brothers and sisters. He had 6 brothers and 2 sisters. I heard my father's father had a pub and was his best customer. My maternal grandparents were both born in Germany. My grandfather worked for a big company that sold office supplies, and they had 2 daughters. My mother, Lisa Latta, and her sister, Kate. My parents met most probably around 1930. There was a considerable age difference, yes, 29 years. They got married in November. Oh, and got engaged on my grandfather's birthday. Um, Her parents were not too happy, her marrying a man that much older. His family said that kid is just marrying you for your money. So nobody was really happy about it, except for them. Theirs was a marriage of love. Yes, definitely. They never really told me about their wedding, and I never really asked either. I only know there were no photos because the photographer didn't show up. But I have an engagement photo. Here it is. Yes, I am an only child, born in Berlin, and my dad also had a store close by in Wallenstrasse. Yes, the furniture store was a successful one. until they weren't allowed to buy from Jews anymore. I guess that most likely dropped sales by quite a bit. I would say my parents were middle class, well-to-do. We had a nice big apartment. No, we weren't lacking in anything. We did not own an automobile. There were no servants or nanny because that was after 1933. Jews were not allowed to have that anymore.
What was it like for your family to live under the Nazis?
Well, my dad was incarcerated for a few days in July of 1938 in Berlin. That was prior to Kristallnacht. There was an action going on, and they were incarcerating Jews for no particular reason. And the way that happened is my uncle, my dad's brother-in-law, owned a store, and he got incarcerated. They just took him off the street. And when they took him, they said, "Well, do you want to call somebody?" And he said, "Yes, I want to call my daughter. I need to give her the keys to the store." So he called his daughter. His daughter went. They did the same trick on her. "Do you want to call somebody?" She said, "Yes, I want to call my uncle to let him know where I am." They called my dad. My dad went. They kept him. They did the same thing on him, but he didn't fall for it. He said, "No, I'm not calling anybody." He realized what was going on. But they were only in the police station in Berlin. But my mother and my aunt, they didn't know where they were, so they just didn't come home. So they went looking for them. And they told her if he did not do anything wrong, they'd let him go within a week. They did let the Jews. These Jews they had taken without any reason, they did let them out. My father, my uncle, and my cousin came home. After that, my father started saying, "That's enough of that. We are not staying here. We are going." And he started to find ways, which wasn't easy because all of the doors of the world were locked. Shanghai was open.
How did your family get out of Berlin?
We left by train from Berlin to Genoa. I do remember we also were allowed to pack possessions in that house. We had a big container which was made out of wood, and we were allowed to take along furniture, which my dad had purchased, taken from his store, thinking especially it would be good for immigration. The whole thing was not clear to people. They really didn't know where they were going. I mean, Shanghai was at the end of the world. It was a big metropolitan city. They had heard about it, but that's about it. So we were allowed to pack that up. There was a policeman in the house watching what we put in there, and then he sealed it. And that went along with us on the train and on the ship, and arrived in Shanghai the same time we did. But no jewelry. The Germans are known for doing everything to the letter. And at one time they said you could take your jewelry, you just had to get permission for it. So my dad made a list of all the jewelry, got permission to take it along. Shortly before we left, they revoked that. And what made it worse is they had a list of everything to give to them. There was, I think, a little gold ring that I had that Dad had forgotten about. So that one he hid. We took that one along, but otherwise, we had to give them everything we had.
So you left through Genoa, Italy. Do you remember what ship you took to Shanghai?
Yes, I do. It was the SS Cantarosso Lloyd Trestino line. We left in April and arrived in Shanghai on May 7th, 1939. It was fun. For me, I was a kid. We didn't, there were lots of other kids aboard ship and we roamed around everywhere and it was just a lot of fun. Only now thinking back, what my parents must have gone through going into the unknown. But, we kids had fun aboard that ship. It was a very nice ship.
That must have been an exciting trip for you.
Yes, the arrival was dramatic due to the fact that my mother was ill and they took her off ship by ambulance, took her to hospital. My father and I, with the rest of the immigrants, were put on trucks and taken to a place called the Embankment Building, which belonged to the extremely wealthy Sephardi Jew, Victor Sassoon. There were these big, huge rooms, and they separated the men from women. I had never been by myself, so here I was in this room with a bunch of strange women. I decided, I guess, to sit on the bed and cry. And my father was desperate. He tried talking to some ladies, and then finally they said, okay, everybody's dressed. You can come in and get your daughter. But I had a cousin who had been living in Shanghai since 1937, and he said, no, you cannot stay here. That's out of the question. So he was living with a Jewish family, and he asked them, could my uncle and cousin stay here for a few days just until this gets sorted out? So my father and I stayed with them for maybe no longer than a week. And then my mom got out of hospital, and we found this quote-unquote apartment in Hongqiu.
Your arrival, I mean the arrival of the refugees from Europe, was also a shock for me, but for a totally different reason.
How so?
I was about 10 years old, and I was surprised to see these people, very poor, shabby, because they came with nothing. I didn't know that foreigners could be that poor. I mean, we knew vaguely about the White Russians who lived in Hongkou. But for Jewish people to suddenly see them? There was something a little of looking down on each other. Mainly the German Jews, who were highly educated, looked down on the Russians, and once my mother did tell one, he came to sell goods or things like that. Well, he said how he was proud to be a German. And my mother said, well, if you were really German, you wouldn't be here. You'd still be in Germany. So she put him in his place.
So you were stateless living in the French concession. What was that like?
Well, I actually thought I was Romanian.
Romanian.
Yes. Well, first of all, we never used the term refugees for my parents, who were refugees. They fled to Manchuria and came to Shanghai. But fortunately, as I said earlier, they were helped by the Sephardim. Then Vladimir Lenin denationalized all those who fled Russia. And so suddenly my parents became stateless. And my father, then he said, because of the people looking down on Russians. He said he was Romanian. Nobody knew Romania. He could say anything. There were no passports to show and things like that. What I felt in school, I was very proud until I was 10 years old. I was very proud that I was Romanian. And then one day I found out from an aunt who said, "No, your father was from Ukraine and lived next to Kiev." But he couldn't live in Kiev because of the Pale of Settlement, so he lived in a little town. So when I found out that I was stateless, I hid it. I wanted to be French, very much to be French. All my friends were French, but I did not have a nationality. Children want to belong. And that's how I felt. That I would have loved. I was steeped in French culture, educations, movies, and I didn't have a nationality. For example, in school, when we raised the flag every day, you had to be a French student, a French citizen, and a good student. Well, I was neither a French citizen nor a good student. So I never rose the flag, the tricolor. So I wanted to be French. Now it's a different story. I'm an adult. I can think properly.
So you attended a French school in the French concession?
Yes, but not at first. My first school was actually the German Kaiser Wilhelm Schule.
A German school?
Yes. My sister attended the Kaiser Wilhelm Schule, and I attended maybe 6 months. When it became 1933, when Hitler came to power in Germany, my father pulled us out.
Oh, and then you went to the French school.
Yes. And as I explain to people, it is very easy. A young child will switch languages without any problems.
What was it like when the French surrendered to the Germans?
Yes. In June 1940. Yeah, things changed after that. You know, Europe was so far away. But the French in Shanghai were very taken aback, very worried, especially when they surrendered. Unfortunately, I would say 80% of the faculty at our high school and their children, they were on the side of Vichy France, those who collaborated with Nazi Germany. They were mentally still fighting the war against England. You know, the 100 Years' War. Because they had lost all their battles to the British. And so, their mentality with some of them was strong. They believed the Nazis should win the war. They hated the King of England. And so we were very disappointed to find out how many of them were on the side, Pétainistes, we called them, for Marshal Pétain, the president of Vichy collaboration estate. But we were not politically aware as we should have been. We were so cut off. Politically, I don't think I was aware. And the newspapers reported the victories of the Japanese and the Germans and what is interesting, when I give my talks about the Shanghai history, I tell people, is there a psychiatrist or a psychologist in the hall? Because I just want to tell them we were never traumatized. Because if my parents, if they spoke about the war, they never did so in front of us. So we had birthday parties. We were very naive, very innocent in many ways. There was no TV. There was nothing, you see, to speak of. So the thing is, I know we did not like the ones we called the Pétanis, those who were for Marshal Pétain. We had big posters. I have the picture there of Marshal Pétain, and you had to salute him. And when they sang songs to the glory, when he said, Maréchal, nous voilà, here we are in front of you, the savior of France. We always ended a group of us, ending the song by saying merde, which is otherwise shit. Well, luckily they didn't hear us. But so our French friends were not Betanis. The few that we had, that we would associate with, we didn't discuss politics. But it was a shock for the French in 1940 to have lost the war. But Esther, tell me, where did you attend school? Did you go to the Shanghai Jewish school?
No, I went to the Shanghai British school, and then we went to Hong Kong after the war, and I went to the King George V school. There was a lot of anti-Semitism from the British, both in Shanghai and Hong Kong. Well, they would come to me during the school breaks and crowd around me and try to hit me or sneer at me and jeer at me and told me I killed Jesus. There were only a couple of the other Sephardi children at the school, and they picked on me so they could become friends with the others. One Sephardi girl in particular picked on me because then she would be what we called sucking up to the non-Jewish British schools. The British students in Hong Kong were still anti-Semitic like nobody's business. Horrible, horrible. It was even worse than in Shanghai because they were older. They were bratty kids. They were between 10 and 13 years old. That's a difficult age. Helga, did you attend Shanghai Jewish Youth Association school?
Oh, yes, that was the main one for our refugee community. And not to be confused with the Shanghai Jewish School, the Shanghai Jewish Youth Association School was also known as the Kaduri School, after the Sephardi Jew Horace Kaduri, the main benefactor of the school.
Yes. The Sephardim helped the refugees, just as they had my stateless Russian community.
What was the Kaduri school like, Helga?
In the beginning, some of our teachers were British. There was one teacher, Mrs. Beresford. She was really, really nice. And once after Pearl Harbor, all the British subjects were interned in Shanghai.
Yes, such as my family.
Yes, like your family, the British teachers were in the internment camps set up by the Japanese. So then our teachers were either Russian Jews and a lot of German Jewish teachers. And my class teacher for many years was Mr. Gassenheimer. You know, after the war, Mr. Gassenheimer emigrated to the United States. He was an excellent teacher, not just as a teacher, but as a person. He made it a point to look up the passenger list of every ship that came in from Shanghai to see if his students came. And he would go to the ship and greet them. I mean, that was quite an effort in those days. So, on the whole, the school was excellent.
Helga, you mentioned Pearl Harbor.
Yes, December 8th, 1941.
Yes. In the United States, everyone remembers it as December 7th, 1941. But for us in China, it was December 8th.
Esther, did the Japanese intern your family as enemy combatants immediately after that?
Not immediately, but yes. Yeah, as a British citizen living in Shanghai, the Japanese took over my family and I were automatically enemy combatants. So, straight after Pearl Harbor, the day after, the Japanese marched into every single major and significant business and took over train company, electricity. And they went into my father's business as well and demanded the keys and asked, who's in charge? And when they got rid of everyone except the top people who could teach them the business so that they could take over completely, I wrote about it in my poem. Our life was changed forever. They stripped us of our wealth. They had a long agenda and followed it with stealth. They bombed Pearl Harbor in 1941 and then in 1942 imprisoned Allied residents in camps they built all new. My mother had Japanese pupils, and she said that the Japanese pupils she had took over our apartment when we went into the camp. And we had Japanese friends. They were our friends. So we never thought that the Japanese were going to do what they did. To this day, it's like a mystery how these people who had such gentle things about them as well could become so cruel. What they did was unbelievable, actually. I don't know what they were thinking. So straight after that, my father had to appear at a certain place and he told us we were going to be interned. And we had a designated camp and a designated date. But because the Japanese had no idea it was going to be such a huge intake, they had to stagger it. And there were about 8 or 9 camps in Shanghai, and so we were the last intake. We went in, luckily, as a whole family, 5 of us. Our first camp was Yuyuan Road. We lived not far from the camp, so we were able to have men with carts take our stuff to the camp on the day that we were to arrive. And my mother took trunks. Mother put the trunks of all of us on top of each other and side by side and said, I have made a cave of trunks. So when bombs were falling, the Americans were bombing Shanghai, she'd say, come on, we're hiding in my cave of trunks. And she tried to take the fear out of us and tried to save us in case something fell from the ceiling or whatever.
Did you have religious services in the camp?
On Friday evening, we used to do the Shabbat service, and my mother would light. She would make wicks out of cotton and a drop of oil so that it would stay light for a bit. And she would light that and do the Friday night service.
Your mother sounds like she figured out how to make the best of an awful situation.
Yes. My mother put on shows in the camp. She put on 3 shows. One was called Hell's Bells, in which she had the king of hell choosing someone that he wanted. And she was like a woman 4 times his size. And there were dancers, and they made costumes out of anything, pieces of rag, whatever they could find. And I was on the stage. I was dancing and doing all kinds of stuff. Everyone who had a bit of talent, or not even, if they wanted to be in the show, they were in it. My mother was in charge, more or less, of the children's kitchen.
What did you have to eat in the kitchen?
Well, food was rationed out, and we ate in the dining hall. We were given like 1 egg a week, and they made soup in huge, big containers. And one day the soup was red pink, and the guy who was saying, oh, please don't worry, I'm so sorry, nothing's wrong with the soup. Someone had washed red socks and hung them above the soup, and they'd fallen in. And, well, everybody ate it because we had nothing else. And, they used to give us huge marrow bones. That was lovely. Big bones, and they were full of marrow, and very little meat on it. So that's what we ate. And my mother got those marrow bones and she dried them on top of the roof. And then when we did that show called Hell's Belts, she had these marrow bones and the devils were banging them on each other. And she made up these words, humba-tappa-lo-lo, humba-tappa-lo-lo. And they were clacking these dried bones on each other. They made up things. Anything went. You can just imagine. It gives me another idea for a lyric. The Japanese interned us. Our fears for safety grew. We and other allies were prisoners of war and suffered deprivations we'd never had before. 3 years of isolation, more serious and sad. Survival was a challenge during a time that was so bad. Helga, as my family and I were interned, excuse me, you and the refugees were living in the so-called designated area, yes?
Yes, yes. Well, my family and I already lived in that area. But up until 1943, not all Shanghai refugees were in Hongqiu. In February 1943, the Japanese came out with a proclamation that all stateless persons who arrived in Shanghai after January 1st, 1937.
Yes, yes, not stateless Russian Jews like me. We had arrived well before then.
Yes, yes, all stateless persons who arrived in Shanghai after January 1st, 1937, had to move into the so-called designated area within Hongqiu.
What some people call the Shanghai ghetto.
Yes, but nothing like the Holocaust ghettos in Europe. For one thing, we were not separated from the Chinese. They lived there too. And the Japanese were not putting us there to kill us, like what happened to so many of my family in Europe. But after the Japanese established the ghetto, I mean, there was no leaving the ghetto. And our school was actually 2 blocks outside the ghetto, and we had to go to the well-known Goya.
Goya? The Japanese official in charge of the passes.
Yes, Kano Goya. We had to go to Goya and get these little cards, which we hung around our neck, which was the permission for us to go to school, but that didn't mean we could wander around anywhere else. It was just for school and back home.
I remember telling my sisters, lucky we don't have to go to Hangkou. Well, if we were selfish. I mean, we lived the same way. The cook was no longer with us, but the ama, that is our nanny, was still with us. We stateless Russian Jews were not sent to internment camps after 1941 because we were not enemy combatants of the Japanese and we were not affected by the proclamation of 1943.
Yeah. Well, we kids, we didn't pay much attention to the proclamation. But my parents, of course, for them it was a big deal. Uh, the war years in Hongqiu were difficult. There was no money, there wasn't a lot of food. You could go to the market and buy a few things, you know. My father was very good at making do with very little. He always managed to make at least one meal a day, no matter how. And, money-wise, when we first came to Shanghai, my father said, "Oh, there's a need for screen doors and windows in summer." So he made those and he sold them. But when winter came around and nobody needed screen doors, so he came up with he was going to make lard. So he did that a couple 3 years, but then he got sick and he couldn't do that anymore. My father had colon cancer, right? He got sick in 1944, I'd say it was before the war ended. They found he was able to get a doctor to operate on him in the French concession. So him being sick, they allowed him to be transferred out. But my mother had to get a pass in order to go and visit. That was a Goya thing again. My father didn't stay in the French concession. He was just there for the hospital stay, and then came back. And before that, we lived in a room in camp. There were 14 people to a room. I was the 15th and the only kid in there. The other were all older couples. At that time, we used blankets and sheets to separate, got dressed and undressed in bed because there was no other space. But when he came back, he had a colectomy. And they said, well, in that state, he cannot stay in a room with so many people, so they gave us a private room. Very tiny, about half the size of this room, but at least we could close the door and be on our own there.
What did your mother do?
Oh, she worked as a seamstress. You want a little anecdote on that? There was one day in July that Mum had a dress to deliver, and she took off to the client's house to deliver the dress. The bombardment started while she was going there, and a Chinese guy pulled her into his store and made her sit under his counter. When she came out, there was all kinds of dead and wounded on the sidewalk. She could not go to that lady's house because the lady's house had been bombarded. So she came home, and my dad and I, we were standing, watching people and stretchers come with the wounded and the dead, and we were waiting for her. Whew. And finally, she came. The lady she was supposed to deliver the dress to was okay, but her husband and her son had been wounded. And the lady was so grateful to have that dress that my mother had made for her because it was such a hot day that she was in her slip having lunch, and she had nothing to wear. That was the only thing she had.
I guess your mother, like mine, made the best of an awful situation.
Yes, yes. But my father, he never got better, the colon cancer. But Esther, how did things play out in your internment camp after the war?
We were alone. There were no other family members in our camp. My mother's family was not interned. She was interned because she was British, married to a British. Once my grandfather came to visit my mother's father, and she sat with him at table, and they just basically cried. We were starving, and we had nothing. And the Japanese stole all our Red Cross rations and everything and stored them. They were found afterwards in warehouses in Shanghai, the stuff they had stolen. At the end of the war, I remember that the Japanese came out and stood on the stage, and they said, Japan is victorious, but they're going to have to leave, and none of us must leave the camp. They had an agenda to kill us all. They had orders. But they disappeared. I don't know what happened. None of us know. But I think they were repatriated to Japan quickly before anyone could get them and kill them for what they had done to us. So they disappeared. All gone. Well, we had to wait because they told us there were snipers. And the Americans were dropping fabulous parcels, but they were falling outside the camp. And in the daytime, it was too dangerous because of the snipers, so nobody went out. But at night, they would go and collect. But the Chinese were waiting to get the parcels as well, so they would come and grab them. And in those things were all sorts of things, like chiclets, chewing gum, and shoelaces, canned condensed milk, salmon, or something in tins, all kinds of stuff that they just... Wonderful, wonderful things. So we stayed in the camp for quite a while until they told us it was safe. Some people had nowhere to go. The British had nowhere to go. Some of them, they had to wait for a ship to come and take them. But we went back to our apartment. But it took a while. It took a while.
I remember. At the end of the war, there was a lot of jubilation. And some of the Jewish boys went out and smacked up the Japanese pretty good there with all their pent-up anger.
And then came the Americans.
Yes, the Americans were fabulous. They came and liberated us in Shanghai, and they were all over. They were everywhere. They brought music, and they played the piano, and I used to go to the YMCA and watch them. They played fantastic jazz. And the first things I learned in jazz was from them. Well, watching them play, and it changed my life. Do you think jazz would work for my song? As a child and born of China, I never thought I'd be a POW during wartime, would be no longer free. My Shanghai life was blissful, abandoned and enjoyed, until Japan took over and evil deeds employed. All allies were imprisoned. We were the enemy. Thank God we were all still alive when free at end year 3.
I dated the sailors and soldiers who came. My sister, who happened to be beautiful, she had all the officers. I had, what do you call, the non-commissioned. And they all proposed. I don't know why. I think it was for them to see if I said yes. They would feel very good, and then they disappeared. They disappeared. I had that experience. But that's okay because I was still very naive about life. Protected as we were in Shanghai, with the servants never having washed a dish or anything. After the war, my parents invited the soldiers. My father, though, was disgusted because Americans used to put their feet on the table, you know, a low table, and chew gum. It was so shocking for him. He never wanted to go to America. He said, "Why go? They shoot guns out there."
We were very wealthy before the war, so after the camp we went back to our apartment. There was nothing left in the apartment. They had stripped everything. We stayed, 3 more years in Shanghai, and my father then said, "The communists are coming, we really have to go." So we went to Hong Kong, and after 3 years, when the Korean embargo took place, nothing could come in or out, so my mother said, "We have to go." So we went to Israel in 1951, with nothing. Poor.
Helga, what did your family do after the war?
Well, then, of course, after the war, all the news started coming in, and people really didn't know, what there was. There were these long lists, and people used to look at the lists, looking for names from the Holocaust. My father's family, there were 9 children. One of the sisters, her husband and son, were all killed in the Holocaust. And 3 of the brothers got killed in the Holocaust. One had 2 sons. They were killed too. My mother's family were all killed. My mother had been able to send my grandparents papers to come to Shanghai, but my grandfather had this heart attack or stroke and wasn't able to travel, so they stayed there. I've got the details. They were transported out of Berlin He died in Theresienstadt, and they deported my grandmother to Treblinka, where she was killed. And there are stumbling stones in German, Stolpersteine, for them in Berlin, in front of the house where they used to live. I don't know if you are familiar with that program.
Yes, yes. That is where they have little brass plaques in the ground with the names and fates of people who were persecuted by the Nazis.
Yes, here is a picture of the Stolperstein that is in front of my grandparents' apartment. That is where my cousin and I used to play hide and seek. Yes, yes. And as I said before, my mother had a sister. She and her husband were killed, and their daughter, my cousin, Inga Sommerfeld, with whom I used to play hide and seek, was murdered in Auschwitz in February 1943.
The very same month as the proclamation in Shanghai.
Yes, February 1943, yes. Over the years, I have had to come to terms with being referred to as a Holocaust survivor. In the beginning, when they said to me, "You're a Holocaust survivor," I somehow didn't feel that was the right designation. I did not survive the Holocaust in Europe. No, Shanghai was no paradise, but it was nothing compared to what was going on in Europe. But yeah, they still designate that as a Holocaust survivor. I've gotten more accustomed to this now.
Where did you go? The United States?
No, Polish quota. Pretty soon after the war ended, because the rumors were out that the communists were working their way towards Shanghai. Plus, Shanghai was not the place we wanted to stay. So my parents looked at the options. The United States, that was no. Polish quota, didn't work. Going back to Germany? Not really. Israel wasn't a state yet, so he had the sister in Bolivia, and after the war, they got into contact again, and my cousin was able to get the papers so that we could come there. Jewish organizations, they took care of the fare to get us there.
How long did you stay in Bolivia?
Oh, 23 years, a lifetime. There were a few Shanghai Jews that went to Bolivia, but not very many, and nobody stayed there as long as I did. And then I came to Bolivia, and like my dad said, you come from one misery to the next. And he was adamant. He said to my mother the next day, "You go and register us for the United States. We are not staying here." Well, he died a year later. He never made it out of there. And Mom and I, we got an affidavit from my cousin, but we didn't have the money to pay for the fare. And another cousin tried really, really hard, and he found a Jewish organization that was ready to lend us the fare to come, which was a week after the visa expired. So I'm telling my children, see, that was all meant for you, because I wouldn't have married your dad if I would have left at that time.
When did you first come to the United States then?
In 1971, as I said, my husband, Eric Silberberg, I met him in Bolivia. He had a strong personality, was always involved in Jewish life in La Paz, and he was the kind of person that would give the shirt off his back for his family. Together, we ran a store. When we arrived in the United States, in San Francisco, I started working at a bank. I started out as part-time teller, then I went to deposit boxes, safe deposit box custodian, head teller, operations officer, and so on. I retired as a bank manager.
Lillian, when did you get to the United States?
Much earlier. But I stayed longer in Shanghai than you two.
When did you leave Shanghai?
Not until March 1951.
Oh, 1951. That means you were there during the first years of communism.
Yes. And then I went to Japan.
Japan?
Yes, Japan.
Oh, goodness, no. My family and I could not have gone to Japan after what the Japanese did to us.
You mean in the internment camp?
Yes. They imprisoned us and kept the Red Cross food from us.
Yes. But remember, the Japanese had left us stateless Russian Jews alone. Your experience with the Japanese in Shanghai was totally different from ours. So we had no problem going to Japan. But the problem I had in Japan was not the Japanese. It was the racism I witnessed toward the Japanese by the Americans.
The Americans?
Yes, towards the Japanese. Yeah, well, when I went to Tokyo, it was American occupation. And I went on the metro. I went first class, all alone. There wasn't anyone because the GIs had their trucks and things like that. And next to me was this third class, packed with Japanese, The Americans wanted to show, at the very, very beginning, you stayed there. So I took the privilege. I had the privilege of being white again, seeing this time as an adult just what colonialism meant. And when I went to the United States, I saw this racism again, but now towards people of color. We went to Boston because that is where my sister went with the GI that she married. Of course, I didn't appreciate the fact that there was a horrible discrimination against black people. I remember an incident. I went with some French classmates to Florida in the back of the bus. And the driver said right away, "Come on up in front, otherwise I'll kick you out of the bus." We didn't understand that. So I think after coming to the United States and seeing the discrimination, I realized we were somewhat in the same situation, though there were no laws there. Here in the United States, you had laws against black people. We had no laws like that in Shanghai. And that is when I started to realize that I had grown up in a racist society in Shanghai, and that I had been a little racist in Shanghai without even knowing it. But I grew. I became more philosophical. Why would I be superior to anyone else? It was a process. You don't get it immediately.
Yes. Racism toward people of color. That I saw up close living in South Africa as I did for so many years.
You lived in South Africa.
Yes, but not right way. Well, when we arrived in Israel, we had to go straight to a quarantine camp for 3 weeks, and then we were moved into a ma'arabat, which is a refugee camp, and we lived in a tent initially, and then we lived in the huts. I lived in Israel for 6.5 years, and then I married a volunteer of the army. I was in the Sinai campaign in the war, and I was in the entertainment corps. I sang with a big band.
This sounds like another opportunity for a song.
Yes, I've written so many poems about my life, and I've always wanted to set them to music, but I don't know if I'll have time before the play.
Oh, I think just the poem would be lovely. Can we hear more?
Oh, okay. Let me see. Yes. Oh, here's a part about my time in Israel, then South Africa. That's how we got to Israel, a newly developed state, where refugees were arriving at a truly marathon rate. The doors were open wide, a haven for those who chose, returning to the homeland from a past so sad with blows, from death, destruction, expulsion, crimes I can't tell here. Israel was a blessing escape from death and fear. 6 years passed. I was a soldier, got married, and I left to live in South Africa. That year I was bereft and missing all my family. Then started with my own. That helped a lot with stopping me from feeling so alone.
That was beautiful.
Yes, marvelous.
What was life like in South Africa?
Well, I lived in an area where there were other Jewish families. It was a very small community, very close-knit. You know, I grew up in a Sephardic beginning, but when I married, I never met another Sephardi. A South African for 36 years until I sold my apartment. So I was totally involved, only in Ashkenazi style of synagogue stuff and all of it. The Ashkenazi music was so tuneful, much more tuneful than the Sephardi way. So when I was in South Africa, of course, it was very easy for me to get into that because I love singing.
But you still felt alone.
In South Africa, I was a curiosity. Basically, I was a cosmopolitan girl who had lived in a melting pot, and now had to come to this place where we weren't allowed to be friends with the staff who worked for us and where nobody knew the last name of anyone. Then I went to Canada because I wanted to leave South Africa always, and after 5 years I became a Canadian citizen, and I became a citizen almost simultaneously with my British passport expiring, because the British would not renew it because I was born in a British protectorate, not in England. They really did us dirty, really. So at that stage, I was so happy to say, cheers, I'm a Canadian and happily so. But then one of my daughters sponsored me here in the United States, and on October 11th, 2007, I became a citizen of the United States.
What was life like for you in Boston, Lillian?
Oh, when I came here to the United States, I saw the opportunities. If you worked hard, people were opening the doors to me. If they saw that I was serious, Americans were very, very helpful. Like Boston University. I was a secretary. That was my ambition in China, to be a secretary. And the Department of Foreign Languages, they recognized in me what I did not know. That I have a classical education, the French education. So they suggested, you are here, you can get free courses at Boston University. So I always went part-time to Boston University. I was working full-time. And that's what I did. And then I got a job at Boston College, and I finished my PhD while I was working there. My thesis on Voltaire was published in England. I then worked 2 years as a visiting instructor at MIT, and there was no position for me there. I decided, time to leave Boston. I decided to move to Washington, D.C., because I had a niece living there. And I got a job at George Washington University for 1 semester. And then I was lucky. I got into the government because I have a small pension from the government. I worked during the Reagan administration and George Bush's father. And now, of course, I'm retired, living in my apartment surrounded by Chinese furniture.
And so what does it mean to you to be an American?
Well, You see, it was just remarkable for me to get here in the first place. You see, Helga, you fell under the Polish quota.
Yes,
That was not good.
yes, the Polish quota was not good.
The Polish quota was not good. But given that I was born on Chinese territory, at that time I was affected by the 1882 Exclusion Act, where no Chinese could emigrate to the United States unless they were wives of some diplomats. When the quota system started in 1925, they took 2% of every immigrant nationality who was in the United States at the time. Fortunately for Chinese, after 1882, no one came. So there was hardly anything. So what happened was there was no quota. It was only, I think, in 1924 they decided to give to the Chinese 105 immigration visas a year. 105. While the Scandinavians may have had 40,000. The Germans may have had 50,000. So, what happens to us? You're based on race and place of birth. My place of birth was China, so that was a no-no. Race was okay. I was white. So finally, I tried to get a visa. Unfortunately, I couldn't leave before the PLA walked, the People's Liberation Army, walked into Shanghai May 25th, 1949. The American consulate closed its doors in 1950, so I couldn't apply. Fortunately, we had friends who lived in occupied Japan. They managed to get me a visa to get out on a status through the UN because I was stateless. So I went to Tokyo and I waited 1 year before I got my immigration visa. And the immigration visa says quota China. In parentheses, it says white. They distinguished between the Asians, Chinese, and anybody that was white born there.
Racism.
Yes, and as I said, I saw the racism of Americans in Japan, and then here the horrible discrimination against people of color. But even so, I remember becoming an American in the 1950s, and I was extremely proud, and that I was in a democracy.
Yeah. It means an enormous amount to me to be an American. First of all, remember that all my life I sang American songs from childhood. Then the Americans liberated us. I just loved Americans. You know, I wrote on the top of my geography book, which my father showed me when I was in Israel visiting, I will live in America one day on top of the American map. So there's something in serendipity and positive thinking that works. How about for you, Helga?
After a while, the Germans offered to reinstate us with a German citizenship, maybe around 1950, 1952, somewhere around there. So when it came time that I'd have to have a passport because we wanted to travel, I took the German passport back. Just a piece of identification for me. I'm a citizen of wherever I happen to live. Yes, I still have a German passport. It's a European passport now. Good document to travel with.
Kim says that he and Kari-Anne would like the play to contain the messages we would like to convey to the young people. I really like this idea.
You know, when Kevin asked me about the meaning of Shanghai to my life, I thought of my father immediately. Any day I feel down, I just say, look at what he went through. You are lucky. And the one thing he told me, which I keep trying to repeat to my own children, always look below you, not above you, and you'll be happy.
Well, I learned after Shanghai how much I had been part of a colonialist society and how much I had undervalued Chinese people and Chinese culture. The Chinese, how poor they were. There was no sympathy for the Chinese lower class. I see that as important to focus on. I think how we treated the rickshaw drivers in Shanghai. I bargained with him for a couple of copper coins, and if I had not bargained, he could have bought perhaps some vegetable, because I thought it was natural to bargain. And seeing the babies wrapped in straw, dead on doorsteps to be picked up just like garbage, and it was natural to me. I can look back about being a racist without knowing that I was one. It's environment. Your environment makes you what you are. But you had to get out of it. You have to grow out of it.
I want to tell people to accept any challenge that comes their way and that you can survive anything if you just have the will to do it. And that you shouldn't think only of yourself, because the more you help other people, the more you survive. Look at what happens in life if you only know that something very interesting will happen and wait for it to happen. I've got a little card I've got on the board in my room. It says, expect a miracle and accept a miracle. And basically that's true. That's a motto. You can expect a miracle, but you have to accept it, right? To have it happen for you. And if people see you for surviving, they're going to survive as well. Just keep doing stuff that you love and helping other people along the way. And you know what? It's true. It's true. You survive. Look at me. I lived in a tent. I lived in a hut. I lived with nothing. I got divorced with nothing. I walked out with nothing. And the next thing, what happened? I was sent to London. I went to work in Greece. And now I paint Greek paintings. And I wasn't an artist at the time. So open the door. Open. People see 12 doors and only one is opened. They only look at the closed doors. They never see that open door. They just look at all the bad doors. Isn't it fascinating that 3 girls of Shanghai can have such varied stories to tell?
Yes, but then again, we have found that we 3 girls have a lot in common.
Yes, but 3 girls of Shanghai. I'm not so sure that the title works.
Well, we're definitely not girls anymore.
Again, I will not reveal my age. But what I mean is, will people know that we are Jewish? Jewish women from Shanghai.
You know, my parents and I survived the Holocaust by getting out of Europe to Shanghai. Because of Shanghai, we survived, and the Jewish traditions that I hold dear are being passed down to generations of my family. And my family has grown and grown. You know, it takes me 2 days just to get ready all the Rosh Hashanah gifts for my children, grandchildren, and great grandchildren. Not bad for the only child of Samuel and Lisa Lotta Maya.
Ah, that's beautiful. You know, for me, it all comes down to this. I believe in godliness, in goodness.
Well, religiously, you ask me what is my religion, I'm Jewish. And I may go to temple on high holidays, and I think that is the extent. But I am proud of the accomplishments of Jewish people under such repression for 4,000 years.
Well, then let's hope the advertisements and the play itself make it clear that we are Jewish. But more importantly, how will people know we are three beautiful Jewish women of Shanghai?
Well, maybe at the end they could put pictures of us to show the audience what we really look like.
Yes, yes. And then people will know that this play titled Three Girls of Shanghai is really about three beautiful Jewish women of Shanghai. I told Kevin that I thought that was a better title. Well, let's just hope that Kevin and Kari-Anne incorporate it somehow.
As child and born in China, I'd never thought I'd be a prisoner during wartime, would be no longer free. My Shanghai life was blissful, abandoned and enjoyed, until Japan took over and their evil deeds employed. Oh, allies were imprisoned, we were the enemy. Thank God we all were still alive when free at end year 3. We spent 3 years during World War II as prisoners of war of Japan during occupation of China's sovereign shore. We were prisoners without freedom. My parents purchased several things, essentials that were rare, 2 bicycles, appliances, some clothes, a Frigidaire. Of course we packed our piano, most essential to be sent. We're pianists, it was truly hard our world to reinvent. We left Hong Kong, the life we knew, it was the saddest day. My father couldn't join us then, he stayed for months away. For all of us, without his help, we struggled to survive. But still we counted blessings, despite the war we were